It's a beautiful screen right now. Isn't that fantastic? That's fine. It's not a big deal. It makes it sound like we're in stream proceeding or coder, but we're not. Oh, there it goes. Cool. Alrighty, so now that the stream is working, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to DefSec, everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about Palo Alto firewalls and what you can do to secure those in a CCDC environment. I'm Chase. Most of you probably know me. Mike wanted to be here tonight, but he had to work, unfortunately, so he can't zoom in. So if you guys want a link to these slides, you can follow that link right there. If you go into the DefSec channel on Slack, I also posted a link, so either way, you should be able to go and have a link to all these slides. We'll just leave that up there for a second for whoever wants to grab it. And as always, just head over to attendance.defsec.club and make sure to fill out your attendance for this week. And we do have just a couple announcements this week. Just a reminder that the next mock competition is this weekend. So it'll be on February 8th, and it'll run from 2 to 6, so it's a 4-hour mock competition. And should be a lot of fun. How many teams do we have registered right now? Gotcha.
We're running essentially 2 local teams at the moment and 4 remote teams.
Okay. Yep, so we've got 6 total teams registered, 2 local, 6 remote, and should be a great time. This is going to be our last mock competition before the regional qualifier, and I think before regionals as well, so should be good practice. Yep. And just as a reminder as well, CyberConquest signups are still open, so it'll be March 27th and 28th. It'll be taking place on 2 different rounds, spread out over the 27th and the 28th. This will be at DakotaCon as well. So if you're there, you're looking for something to do during the con, I highly recommend signing up. CyberConquest is an awesome competition. You should definitely do it. Once again, you can hit that sign up link right there. And I think it should also be in Slack as well, so should be able to get all signed up for that. And I deployed all of the VApps out to you guys earlier today, so you should have them already. But in the event that you don't, your VM in the catalog will be defsec_palo_2020. So just as kind of a quick introduction, we're going to kind of go over what is Palo Alto, like what are Palo Alto firewalls, why do we use Palo Alto in CCDC and like the enterprise environment in general, and how do we take advantage of Palo to keep the hackers out of not just the Palo, but everyone else's boxes too. So we'll dive a lot more into that tonight. So just kind of to start things off, what is a Palo Alto firewall? If you've been with DefSec long enough, you've probably heard this term thrown around a bunch. A Palo Alto firewall is just a type of network firewall appliance. So to kind of read bits and pieces of this wonderful definition I found here, they're basically security devices that sit at the very front of your network and control unauthorized traffic coming in. So basically what you'll do with a firewall is you'll allow the traffic you want to come in through firewall rules. You can also deny traffic this way, depending on if you want to have it be allow all or allow all by default or block all by default. Any other traffic that doesn't match these rules will get blocked. So it'll be like your liaison between you and the outside world, and it's also going to be your first line of defense for stuff trying to come into the network. So these firewalls are really, really important. And they also give you a lot of flexibility, which we'll talk about. So looking at more traditional kind of firewalls that you might have worked with in previous mock competitions or other environments, like Windows Firewall or IP tables, these are called host-based firewalls. So these are going to be specific to your host. They're going to have rules that are specific for the box that you're on, and that's it. So you'll set those, and that'll be great. But where appliances like the Palo come in is you'll be able to have one of these at the front of your network, and the person that's sitting on your Palo will be able to make rules that extend over your entire network. So they can do these by box, they can do them by service, kind of breaking it down really granularly and giving your whole network just that little bit more security. And a lot of times too, with these high-end firewall appliances, you'll see a lot more than just firewall rules too. You'll be able to do a lot more with them. Like Palo in particular, you can do antivirus, so inspecting traffic for kinds of malware. You can, if you have root certificates installed on your devices, you can decrypt SSL and TLS traffic coming into your network. So a lot of times you'll see attackers having encrypted traffic, and you as a defender, you're going to have a harder time understanding exactly what they're doing and what kind of data they're exfiltrating unless you can break those encrypted sessions down and figure out what they're doing. So provided that you have a root certificate installed on all of your devices on your network, you can decrypt SSL traffic coming to and from your network. And something we'll talk about that's a little bit different than your traditional firewall, like if you use pfSense. A lot of times when you're working with Palo on what you're allowing and blocking through, Palo lives a lot on the application level, the application layer, so kind of that more layer 7 approach if you're thinking about the OSI model. Like traditionally with what you might have worked with like pfSense and things like that, you'll be blocking by source and destination, by port, that kind of stuff. So all that lives at like layer 3 and layer 4 of the OSI model. But Palo, they have a huge like glossary of different applications and different kinds of resources that they have set up. And they do deeper inspection of what's coming in. So you can actually block by specific applications instead of just blocking by port and source and destination IP. So Palos are really powerful, and they have a lot of great features that we're going to go into some more. But first, I kind of touched on this before, but why would you use a network firewall compared to like why not just have everything be host-based firewalls? Kind of with like what I was touching on, having that one central point where you can distribute rules over the entire network, it gives you a lot better control, and it also scales a lot better. So you can save a lot more time by just kind of doing it in one central location and being able to. And of course, you should still do host firewall rules as well, but being able to do this at the network level really gives you a lot more flexibility on what you're able to control and what you're able to block. So, and kind of like what I was mentioning with all the features that Palo has, you also typically have a lot more features in a full-fledged appliance, like say a Palo Alto or Fortinet or things like that. And Palo has a lot of these features, so probably honestly more than could feasibly be fit into one of these presentations. So we'll just kind of touch on some of these tonight, some of the more common ones you'll see, some ones you'll find useful for the mock, and kind of go from there. So when we're talking about Palo Alto, we of course have to talk about the operating system that it runs on. So in the case of Palo Alto, this is called PanOS. So everything that runs on Palo Alto exists inside of this PanOS. It's relatively similar to anyone that's used like Juniper's JunoOS, if you've worked with their firewalls before, if you've used pfSense. There's a lot of extra features. It's laid out a little bit differently, but the kind of core idea should be relatively the same. Like you have a web interface, you have a command line interface, and they're each kind of good for different things. So again, with Panos, just like with everything else, you'll have web and you'll also have a command line. The command line is really nice. It's really fast. It has nice syntax. It's really good for doing that kind of early stage like bootstrap setup. So a lot of times in like the mock competition environments, you'll find that your Palo you're going to get is already configured. So like it's set up in a layer 3 configuration, and it has IP addresses. It just doesn't really have a whole lot else configured. Like it's not going to have a whole lot in the way of security zones configured or other stuff like that. But if you're, say, at a competition like National CCDC, you're much more likely to have a Palo that you're going to just be handed in a box, and you're going to have to take it and set it up. So like just getting that initial IP addressing and stuff like that done. So the CLI is really nice for that, just getting that bootstrap setup done until you can get to the web interface and then work from there. The GUI is really nice in Palo. It's broken down in a way that's pretty easy to understand. There's a lot of different tabs that all do their own things, and we'll go through those, but I really, really like the GUI on Palo. Like, I find it really intuitive, and I think you guys will too. And like I said, just the amount of features they give you for doing layer 7 filtering is crazy. There's entire sections of the GUI that are just dedicated to the different kinds of layer 7 filtering you can do. So kind of touched on this a little bit again, but so you know about the Palo, you know kind of what it is and what it does. How does this all tie into CCDC now? So last week when we talked about ESXi, I mentioned that it's the second most important host on your network, ESXi is. So now this week, we're going to show that Palo, or your network firewall, is the most important host on your network. So these kinds of appliances, these firewalls, they're going to be basically your first line of defense against red team. So ideally, whenever red team's trying to get into your network and they're trying to figure out what all is there, and they're trying to keep their persistence alive, they're trying to pivot, they're trying to do all that kinds of stuff, ideally your Palo is going to be that kind of shield in the way that's going to shut down their connections. It's going to stop them from pivoting around and kind of controlling those ingress and egress connections. So if you really use Palo to its full potential, like you're going to make red team have a really, really bad time. So And again, there's a lot of features that you can kind of use there. So we'll just go through the more common ones tonight. And again, just like with ESXi, Palo is something you're going to want to keep protected at all costs. So this is another thing that red team's going to be going for like right out of the gate. So basically to understand where this sits kind of architecturally in a network, so like everything's going to be going through your Palo, like through your Palo out to, say, the scoring engine, the network, all your scored services. So if red team's able to say, get on your Palo and decide that they don't want it to exist anymore, and they flip the switch on your Palo off, you have no more scored services. So among the very first things you're going to want to do when you get into an environment like this is you're going to want to get on your Palo, you're going to want to lock it down, kick out default users, change your passwords. Do not let red team get in this box under any circumstances, or you guys are going to have a really, really bad time. But if you can get in, if you can beat red team to it, this is probably the most powerful tool you have in your arsenal. So definitely make full use of this as much as you can. So you have a lot of different ways you can manage Palo. So last week, again, when we talked about ESXi, I mentioned that you had some different ways of managing this. You have your CLI, you have your web interface. You can do some scripting if you were feeling so inclined to kind of make everything work together and to be quicker. Kind of the same applies with Palo. You have your CLI, you have your web interface, and I basically already mentioned all this, but the CLI is faster out of the gate, but later on, like some of the more complicated tasks you're going to want to do, it's probably faster to just do the web interface because menus and nice fancy GUI. So if we're talking about the CLI, there's a couple different ways that you can use the CLI in Palo Alto. So they break it down into what's called modes. So the two main modes that you need to know about are configure mode, or operational mode and configure mode. So this is basically the same setup as Juniper or Cisco or any of those products if you've worked with them before. Whenever you first log into your Palo, it's going to drop you in this operational mode. So this is where you land whenever you first log in. And basically what this mode lets you do is this is where you're going to run a lot of like your querying commands, like about, say if you wanted to know about like your network traffic, if you wanted to know about just diagnostic stuff that's going on in the box and just getting metrics, you do it from operational mode. Operational mode is not where you're going to make any changes though. Like you're not going to be able to like adjust your firewall rules from here. You're not going to be able to make changes to the OS itself. That's where operational or configure mode is going to come in. So configure mode, if you're setting up a Palo, this is basically where you're going to live. So in configure mode, you just get here by typing configure in operational mode. And this is the layer of the Palo where you're able to go in and you're able to make all your changes. So from configure mode, you can add firewall rules. You can change your IP address. You can add and delete users. Basically anything on the entire system you can do from configure mode. So we'll kind of go over that. As far as configure mode is concerned, there's a ton of commands here. If you ever want to know in any particular menu what you can do in configure mode, you can just type question mark, and that will auto-suggest you the whole list of commands that are available to you. So say you're typing along in your Palo and you want to figure out what you can do from the show menu. You would type show and then type question mark, and it'll auto-complete you a whole list of things that you can do. So your two like main commands you're going to be concerned with for doing most of your configuration and like checking values is going to be set and show. So like if you wanted to show a list of users that's on the system, for instance, you would do show mgt-config-users from configuration mode, and that would just list out all your users. If you just type show from the very top, what that'll do is it'll just spit out your entire configuration on the screen, and you can just like space through it with spacebar, and you can just like look over your entire config. Say you were hunting for a specific value and you weren't sure where it was. And then another thing, like again, this will be familiar if you've worked with pfSense, is once you've made a change anywhere, even on the web interface, it'll be a little bit different. But anytime you make a change on Palo, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to commit that change. So in the command line, what you do is you just type commit, and this will take your changes and it'll basically just push them to the live version of the operating system. And if there's errors you run into, once you've committed, it'll tell you, and like you can just use set like blah to go back and fix whatever that error is. So remember to always commit. All those changes you're going to do, all those backdoors you're going to kick out, none of it's going to be worth anything if you forget to commit. So always make sure you commit often. Like you'd rather only lose like 1 or 2 commands worth of history, say if you forgot to commit, than making a whole bunch of changes and then just realizing you have to redo like 20 commands over again. So commit early and commit often. So as far as the CLI goes, there's just a couple different commands for managing users that will really come in handy in like the first few minutes of the competition. A lot of what I'm assuming here is that you guys basically have like layer 3 already set up. Like you have an IP address, you're able to like get to a management interface, you're able to do some like, the box is in place, it just needs security, essentially. So something you'll want to do right off the bat, and I think we kind of touched on this already, is you're going to want to change your default admin user password like right away. So just like with your normal, say, Windows or Linux boxes, this is probably going to be something like password1bang right out of the gate. So you can just come in here and type this command here, the set mgt-config users, and on Palo, the default user is usually called admin, but in the event it's something different for whatever reason, you would just replace admin with whatever user it is, and then your password, so like password2@. And I'll show this off a little bit too once we actually get to the VApp, but if you wanted to see, say, a list of users, so say you know there's an admin user, but you do show mgt-config users, and you see there's like red team admin, or red, or not red team. You're going to want to delete those. And so let's say you get through all this, you change all your passwords, and you figure out that there's still a session open on your box, and you see it's from whatever 10.whatever IP address range red team is in, and you need to kick them off. What you can do here is you can restart the management server. So what this will do is this will basically restart everything. It'll kick any active sessions off the box, and basically it'll just restart everything and bring it back up. Now this takes a couple minutes, so make sure if you have important things you want to do it before then, because you'll be down for a couple minutes while the management plane restarts. So what you'll do here is you just do debug software restart process management-server, and that'll just flush that management interface and bring it back online. And if this is something that just applies universally, but I stuck it here, is if you're making multiple changes at once, like in the Palo, say you're changing a password and you're checking for, or you're deleting a user group, or you're sending an IP address on an interface and you want to queue up a bunch of changes at once, what you can do is commit whatever change you want to do and then hit Control-C, and that'll basically push your commit to the background. And then you can go and do another commit on the fly. And then that commit will just queue up after the other one. So you can keep like a queue of things going at once. So you're not just waiting on one thing to commit. As far as the CLI goes, you can also do firewall rules from the CLI, although I will say it's definitely easier to do it from the GUI, and I'll show you why. The first thing you're going to want to do to get to this page is you're going to want to go to the security tab. So you would do edit rule-based security, and that would throw you in kind of the section of PanOS where firewall rules live. And then your kind of syntax for setting these rules from the command line would be set rules default from zone to zone. So typically on a Palo Alto, you're going to have your 2 main zones. You're going to have a trust zone and an untrust zone. So like your trust zone will be your LAN typically. So like this will be like where all your team's VMs live and stuff like that. And then untrust will be anything that's outside of the firewall. So anything that's coming in, for instance, could be coming from an untrust zone, like from the internet. So if you wanted to say do a rule for like SSH or something, you could do set rules default from untrust to trust, source, whatever IP address you wanted it to be, destination to that subnet, and then application, SSH I think it is. Palo has a whole bunch of different names they give their applications, and then service, and then you can set whether to allow or deny that. So I talked about there being a whole bunch of different layer 7 applications that you can do, and that Palo really goes hard on the whole layer 7 thing. So we can go to this link here, and this is just on Palo Alto's website. And they have a whole kind of list of all the different applications that they have in their system. So let's say we wanted to find SSH. So we can pull that up here, and it gives you like the name of the service to block, gives you categories, subcategories, risk factors. It indexes the standard ports, and then it gives you a whole bunch of different characteristics, like is it evasive, is it prone to misuse, is it prone to Is it capable of file transfer? Can it be used by malware? So essentially, if you're in doubt about what kind of service to apply and with a particular firewall rule, and if you can't just find it by searching, you can come to Applepedia here, and they have a pretty conclusive list of just all the different applications that Palo uses. You can also make your own applications, but in a lot of cases, this probably won't be necessary for CCDC. And then next, we can finally get to the web interface that I talked about. So basically everything, for the most part, you can do from the CLI, you can also do from the web interface. Except the CLI makes it really nice, really legible, very easy to understand. You can also set stuff up like your application rules, your threat protection, your URL filtering through the command line. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll show you how to do it from the web interface since it's a little bit easier to understand. Typically what you'll see in like a CCDC environment is you'll want to have like a dedicated GUI box set aside for whoever's going to be your Palo admin to be able to get to that web interface and just be able to work with that. Typically in the past, I think we've used a Windows box for this, but basically anything that has a web browser and is capable of getting to an IP address would work just fine. So we're actually going to dive into the VApp here in a second and go through each of these tabs and kind of explore this web interface. But just to start off with, here's the big, beautiful teal box that is the Palo web interface. You can see it gives you a whole lot of information right off the bat. And you can see along the top we have a bunch of different tabs. So you can see dashboard, ACC, monitor, policies, objects, network, and device. So we'll go through each of these tabs and just kind of explore like what they all do. Whenever you log in for the first time, you're going to always land on dashboard. So if you need to know just like basic information about your box, you can just go here to do it essentially. It just kind of gives you everything right up front. So with that in mind, we can go ahead and actually jump over to the VApp now. Let me find it here. Oh. This wants to cooperate today. What's it doing? There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Let me zoom in a little bit more. So we can just go ahead and log in. And we can flip back to the dashboard here and we'll see that we're in exactly the same place as we were before. So basically, if we just scroll down, you'll be able to see like your system load. You'll be able to see like your serial, and stuff like that. You probably won't need a whole lot of this for the purposes of the competition. But so the first tab we'll actually like dive into is the ACC tab. So this and the monitor tab basically is where you're going to spend if you're like actively trying to monitor for a threat or you're trying to get information about what's going on the network. These two tabs are where you're going to spend most of your time. So basically what ACC does is it gives you a breakdown of like what kind of stuff is going on your network. So like you can see the amount of sessions that there are for certain things. Like we can see here that we have 35 sessions for SSL going on right now. We can see that there's been a lot of ping on the network, been me trying to fix this network. You can see that there's been a lot of Palo trying to call home. So basically if you're looking for just general stats essentially, like say for an inject, your inject handler needed information on what your most used services were on the network. This is where you'd come to see that information essentially, and you could just have a nice pretty little picture that you could show and make life generally easy to understand. You can also break it down by threat activity. So if there were specific types of attacks that Palo was detecting going on, you could see that happening here. I haven't been doing anything really malicious on this network, so there's nothing really filled in there. But say there were red teamers launching like Bluekeep against your boxes and that was getting blocked, you'd most likely be able to see that popping up here. You can also see what activity's been blocked and so on and so forth. So this gives you a very like big picture perspective of what's going on in your network. And if we flip over to the monitor tab, what that'll give you is that this will give you a lot more kind of granular. Yeah. So now if we pop over to monitor, this is where you're going to see the like really granular details of what's going on your network. So you can see like individual sessions and what's going on here. And if you click on this, you can see like in a really verbose view, like exactly what's going on in each one of these entities. Like you can see that this was allowed and it matched a rule called default. And we can see that it was ICMP. And you can see the source, where it's coming from. You can see the destination. So for whatever reason you really needed to get granular and like analyze traffic, this is where you'd come to do it. You can filter by, say, if you wanted to search for any traffic just coming from 10.10.0.1. This will take a second. But you can do that from here. And basically all you can see is that's been going on here is just a bunch of ping, essentially. But like if you were trying to check if, say, a certain IP was acting suspicious and trying to figure out like what they were doing, you could filter down by that IP here and see exactly what they're up to. You can also see different kinds. So we'll go over applying things like the URL filtering and PII filtering, but if you wanted records on what stuff is being matched, you can see that here. So you see the tab up top, and then you also see that there's a bunch of tabs along the side. So if we wanted to start here, we could see, for instance, that for the purposes of this lab, I decided to block YouTube. So let's say we don't want our employees watching any videos on the job. Can't be having them watch any of those red team videos. So I'll show you where I actually made this rule later on that would block YouTube, but for now we can come over here and we can see this session here that we were actually able to block YouTube, and we can see the category that it falls into. I just called mine block list. It categorizes it by like it's on our block list, streaming media, it's low risk. You can see what URL it's going to, you can see where it's coming from, what zones it's transiting between. So this is going to be where you'll spend a decent chunk of time. Like if you go through setting up rules and setting up URL filtering and having all that stuff in place, and you need to verify that it's working, this is the tab where you can come and check that out. You can also start packet captures from here. Like if you wanted to grab like a large amount of traffic and keep it around for later, you can start a packet capture as well. Yeah, there's just so much stuff that Palo can do that it's really hard to fit it all into one session. But spend some time playing around in this. There's really a lot here. And when you, like I said, when you use Palo to its really fullest potential, like you're going to make whoever's trying to attack you have a bad time. So now we can pop over to the Policies tab. And this is where like the core of what you're doing is going to happen here. So this tab right here is where you make firewall rules, essentially. So I just have one here called default that we can kind of look at and see what's going on. So whenever you go to make a new, actually we can just make a new firewall rule. Maybe not, that was the next part of my demo. Show default again. So essentially what you're going to see here, whenever you come in to make a new firewall rule, is you're going to see all these tabs along the top. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to give your rule a name. So again, I just called mine default. You can select what type of rule it is. This one's universal. So that means it just applies anywhere, essentially. Like you can set it to be either intrazone or interzone, but I just set mine to be universal. You can give it tags if you have any tags. And then I just have mine. This is just essentially my any firewall rule that I have set up just to make sure everything's working. These two checkboxes here are set. So what you'll do, I should probably show zones before I show that. So if your Palo doesn't already have them, like whenever you boot it up, I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but we'll talk about it now. Under the network tab, you'll see this tab here called zones. Here from the zones tab, a lot of times when these have already been set up, you'll see these. They might not be applied to interfaces, but they might be there. So these are your trust and untrust zones. So basically what you'll do with each zone is you can take an interface and assign it to that zone. And we'll get back to that later, but just know that if for whatever reason when you're making firewall rules, if you don't have like a trust or untrust zone, just pop over here to this tab and you can go ahead and make it. So come back to security again. And essentially what you can do here is you can set your source zone. So say for whatever reason you just wanted to do a firewall rule by zone and you didn't like need to set an IP address. You could just set the source zone to be, say, anything coming from untrust is essentially what this would be saying. Is if we stuck source zone untrust in here, we would just be capturing anything coming from the untrust zone. And you can do the same thing with IP addresses over here. I just have this checked to any again, but say you wanted to make a firewall rule for something coming from 10.10.10.10, let's say. You could set that as the source address to filter by here. And something that you can do with Palo Alto as well that at least I haven't seen configured, like in a mock competition or anything like that, is you can tie in Palo Alto with LDAP. So if you have that kind of thing set up, you can integrate permissions based on user. So like say you have a bean counter that doesn't need to have access to certain ports on the internet. You can restrict that down by user as well. And then next you can set the destination zone. So earlier when we talked about the source zone, say we had from untrust, this would be where you'd set like to trust here. Or set to, say, you were making a rule for your web server and you wanted it to go to like 192.168.1.10. This would be where you'd set that here. And then moving on next, you can get to applications. So this is where I was kind of talking about earlier, like where Palo's done a lot of work. So if you come down here to add, for instance, I'm actually going to modify this, but you can get through the same list of applications. You can search, say you wanted to do SSH, you could find that there. So, and then next you'll get over here, do more things with this category. And then next you can get to actions. So this action setting here is going to be the important thing here. So you can set it to just like allow or deny. Actually, there's a couple different things you can set here. You can allow it through, you can deny it, you can drop it, and then you have a couple different options for resetting. So you can either just reset the client, you can reset the server, or you can reset the client and the server. And each of these do different things depending on what your use case is. So pick from one of these depending on what you need to do and what kind of blocking you're trying to do. Over here you can also change your settings for if you want to log connections. So say you wanted to create a rule to monitor traffic on a certain port for, I don't know, say you had an IRC server or something specific, and you wanted to monitor traffic going to that. And you wanted to be notified or have an entry in the log every time somebody tried to go to that. You could check both of these boxes here to log at session start and log at session end. So then that way, basically, anytime anything happens with a connection that gets matched by this rule, it'll get flagged. So if you have a vulnerable service, for instance, that you're especially concerned about, and basically you want to see every time something happens with it, you can set that here. So if you go to usage, you can also see like hit count, when the last hit was, when the first hit was. This is basically just supplementary information, but could be useful. So I'll go ahead and cancel that here. And I know we just talked about it, but now we're going to actually do an example of this. So what we'll do is we'll back out to the VApp. And if you guys are following along, there is a couple things we're going to have to do on this web server box. I didn't realize this until I pushed the VApp out to catalog, so it shouldn't be too bad though. So basically all you have to do is go to your etc network interfaces file, and basically all you'd have to do is change this information to match what's here, because for whatever reason this device wasn't pulling an IP address whenever I pulled it down from the catalog, and I didn't realize that until after I'd pushed, but basically as long as you set these settings you should be fine. So I'll leave that up there for a second. if anyone's following along. You can also come back to it later. But basically all we need to know for now is that essentially this is our web server box. So we just have, I can hop over to another box for this. So on the web server, we basically have your run-of-the-mill Apache 2 server running. Oh, lordy, this is broken. So what we can do right now is if we jump over to our attacker box. So this attacker box, we're simulating having red team being on the outside of your network, being able to kind of reach in and get to your services. So let's say right now we're the red team box. And we can hit your web server. So obviously, you're a blue teamer. You want to keep red team off your services, but you also want your services to stay up. So what we should be able to do here is, let me note this IP address. So I'm just using web as an example. Like, in some cases, you need to keep this port open. But for my example, I'm just going to use it as this is something we want to block. This is something we don't want open. So let's say a box has a web server on it, but it's not a scored service. So we can pop back over to Palo here, and we can go ahead and add a new rule. So web call this 102. Rule type universal. So naturally, you probably want to get more granular with your rules, but for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to set the source zone to be untrust. So anything coming from the outside and any source address. Don't care about user here. And then what we're going to do is we'll uncheck that, and we'll add destination zone trust because this web server is on the inside of our network. So we're going to know that this is going to be going to our trust zone, and hence that's the way we're going to set our zones up. And then we'll set our destination address to be 192.168.1.102. And let's say we want to block web. Should work. Where is it? What's it called? It should just be called web browsing. So essentially now what we're going to say is we're going to block anything coming from that external network going to the specific port. And then what we can do over here is we can come to actions and we can set this to be deny. We'll just do drop. And then profile setting default. And I'll show you what a profile is later. And let's say we want to log this at session start. So then we can go ahead and hit OK. And keep in mind too that your firewall rules will be like which rules will be applied will depend heavily on what order they're placed in when you're creating them. So we'll want to move this above our default allow all rule, because if we hit the default allow all rule first, then it would just be allowed. So we can see now that this is all set up. And always remember to commit. So we'll come over here to commit, and it'll tell you just where you're making commits from. For whatever reason you wanted to make a description, you could do that too. And you can go ahead and hit commit. This will take a second. And if you're working on the web interface, you can also just hit close there and then keep going, and it'll just keep committing in the background. So, and that's a warning, but it shouldn't stop us. So now we can see configuration committed successfully. So now what we can do again is when we try to come over here from our red team box again, wherever it went, I think it's still cached. Hold on. I'm trying to figure out how to open a private window. What did I do wrong? Hold on. Is what? The red team box is in untrust. So hold on. Zones. That should be working. Hold on. Oh, hold on, I know what it is. I think. Because I forgot this is behind that. Although that should work, being on that. I'm going to try this and see if it works. Although I guess it shouldn't matter, I don't think. Because in theory we shouldn't be able to hit that anymore. Is it cached? There we go. So essentially what I did is I set it to be on the internal IP address instead of the one that's actually on the outside. That'll be the destination IP address that this is trying to get to, because all of our boxes that are set up on this network are behind like a one-to-one NAT. So I typed in the wrong IP address. So now we can see that when we try to go here from our red team box, that's just going to sit up there and time out to infinity. So this is just an example of, like, say you wanted to restrict a port like against red team. Like, this is what's actually going to happen when you're like flipping the switches. Is red team's not going to be able to get to that port anymore, whatever port it is. If it's SSH, if it's a web server, whatever it is, as long as you're setting that, they're not going to be able to get to that anymore, at least from untrust. So what we should be able to do now is since we turned on all the monitoring, we should be able to come over here to monitor. So what we should be able to see now is, so we can see type deny from zone untrust to zone trust. We can see the source and destination. And we can see that the application that it detected was web browsing. We can see what action it hit, which is the one we set, which is drop. We can also see what rule it was that ended it. So you remember when we were making that rule, we called that rule block web 102, which use better firewall rule names. I just had to think of something on the spot. But so if you had a bunch of different rules set, you could see exactly what it is that's blocking it. And then it gives you a reason for ending it, which is we deny it in our policy. And then if you cared about the size of the connection, you could see that there. So that's more or less how you set, like, where you'll go to set firewall rules on Palo. This will be more for setting it up, but this menu here, the policies menu, is where you can also go to set up NAT. So we have our one-to-one NAT setup done here. So you can see that we're translating 192.168.1.0 slant 24 to 10.10.1.0 slant 24. So if for whatever reason you did have a Palo that was basically unconfigured, this is where you'd come to do like NAT setup. If you wanted to do, hold on, something different. So there's a couple more things in this tab you can play around with as well. This is where you'd come to do the SSL decryption that I was talking about in the event you did want to do that. So what you would need is you would need a root certificate to be able to do that, and you'd have to take that certificate and actually like install it on each one of your systems. And then you'd be able to set the Palo up to gobble up all that incoming SSL traffic and decrypt it back into plain text. So something worth doing if you have the time. So next we can come over here to the objects menu. And this is the menu where you're going to set up all of your neat, fancy custom filtering rules. So again, we can see applications here. If something that's kind of neat you can do too, if you have these tabs here, addresses and say address groups. So let's say we wanted to make an address group. What you could do is you could call this like Linux servers. And if you wanted to add, let's say you have like 3 Linux servers that all require like HTTP, HTTPS, and DNS, or you wanted to make a rule to temporarily be able to manage all of your Linux boxes that need apt. Like say you wanted to have a group of addresses that you can just say, okay, I want to temporarily punch a hole in the firewall for these boxes to be able to use apt. You would add your Linux boxes here, and then you could make a firewall rule that you could toggle on and off and incorporate that address group. So it's definitely something you don't have to do, but if you want to control firewall rules for like a couple different systems at a time, it's something worth checking out, but otherwise it's not really necessary. Coming down here next to custom objects. Oh, not global protect. Oh god. So custom objects is probably my coolest thing that I appreciate about the Palo. So I'm sure you've heard some of you in mock competitions before where it's talked about, like, say the CEO or whoever's in charge wants to block social security numbers from being sent over the network, or they want to block like credit card numbers from being sent over the network. So this is the menu where you're going to come to do that kind of stuff. So where does this start? Security profiles? Hold on. I need to find where this all starts. Because like Palo has this weird thing where you make like one overarching thing and then you can add things onto that object in like 3 different menus. Where is it? Data filtering, I think. Let me find it. 1 second. I think it's still under objects. Security profile groups. There it is. So what we can do here is we can take a look at this. So the first step you're going to want to do here when you come into this menu, like before you can do anything else, is you're going to want to come all the way down to the bottom here to security profile groups. So all those other menus you see, all those security profiles, all those custom objects, those are all going to be used in this security profile group. So you have to make the security profile group first, and then you can manage all the little objects underneath it. So you make the security profile group, and then it basically gets updated with whatever things you're adding in the background. So we can take a look at default here. So I've already taken the liberty of going through and making a couple of these different rules to start with. So like you have an antivirus profile, an anti-spyware profile, a vuln protection profile, etc. So you can do different drop-downs on these. Say there's a default, and then I just called mine default 1. So basically what you would do is once you've made all those groups, you come over here to security profile groups, and you basically toggle those on. And then this security profile group also has to be toggled onto your firewall rules. And I'll show you how to do that next. Like I said, it's like a whole cascading 3 or 4 menu kind of thing. So you'll come through here. I don't think I have a file blocking one set up, but you can change. There's some preset ones. So like for vulnerability protection profile, there's default and strict. Personally, I recommend setting these to strict. And then I don't think I have a data filtering profile set up. So we can go and take a look at, say, an anti-spyware profile. So if you go to security profiles again here, and you go to anti-spyware, you can come over here to this strict 1 rule. And it'll have this different layout of like simple critical, simple high, simple informational, blah, 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 blah. And you can come in here and you can set what kind of actions you want to take. So whenever your rule detects something that matches this profile, you can change what you want it to do. So say if you find something that's critical, you can set the Palo to automatically block that IP for 2 minutes. This is allowed. I'm pretty sure this is kosher because you're not doing like manual IP blocking and it's only temporary. So this is essentially the Palo equivalent of like setting up your fail-to-ban on Linux. So you can also say you wanted to add an exception for something, you can add that here. And then to get that applied, again, you just come back to security profile groups once you have that set up, and then you just tick this to whatever the name of the profile is you just made. So that's an anti-spyware one. There's also an antivirus one, and I'll show you how. Because before you can use all this fancy vulnerability protection and threat protection and stuff like that, you have to make sure your Palo's licensed, and I'll show you guys how to do that next. And you have to make sure it has the newest vulnerability profiles. And then once it has the newest vulnerability profiles, you also have to make sure it has the newest antivirus profiles. So I'll run through that next. But just know for the purposes of right now that that's all already been turned on, and I'll show you how to do that next. So again, if you come into the antivirus profiles, you can just do exactly the same thing as before. You can also set that if something hits your profile to do a packet capture, but again, that's entirely optional. Again, if you come down here to vuln protection, these are both predefined. I didn't change anything here, so you can leave that. URL filtering. So you saw earlier when I was inspecting logs that we saw some traffic that had shown YouTube being blocked. So if you wanted to do that, say you get a wonderful inject that dogsarecool.com isn't allowed anymore. It needs to be blocked. Like the CEO is a cat person. You could come over here, and in this rule set is where you define that. So you need to have a custom URL category already made. And I need to find where that is again. Show that. But essentially what you do here is you would just add your custom URL category to this, and you can set what kind of actions basically you want to be taken whenever you visit that URL. So what you can also do is you can set different URL filtering settings. You can detect for user credentials being entered. So there's a bunch of different settings you can flip in here too. I'll show you the URL category. So for the URL category right now, I just made one called block list. So I just made like one big giant container to hold all the URLs I want blocked. So right now, basically what you can do is you can just come in here and you can add domains to this list. So just to do YouTube, I did star.youtube.com to catch all the subdomains of youtube.com. So like, I don't know if there are subdomains of YouTube, I'm sure there are. And set the type here as well, but it shouldn't matter. So basically whenever you come in here and you're doing these rules, this is where you're gonna come to do them. So if you're gonna block a URL, just come in and drop it here. And then that'll all feed back into your security profile group. And you can also do file blocking. Again, I didn't trust this one. It'll just block like, so essentially what this will do is if you turn on strict file blocking, it's gonna block like EXEs from coming over the network. It's gonna block 7-zip files. It's gonna block .bat files. All the really kind of risky stuff that you'll see. It'll block any like encrypted zip files, so on and so forth. And then my personal favorite, oh wait, where do we do data filtering? So something else you can do, and this is my personal favorite, is you can also come down here and you can make what's called a data filtering profile. So let's say we wanted to block SSN. And what you can do is you can add a rule here and give it a dropdown. Wait. Hold on. Uh-oh. I went too many layers deep. What did I do? So you can set like what kind of files you want to block. So say you're only looking for social security numbers in Word documents. You can do that. what's going on here. There should be, I got this last night because it should show, oh wait, I had the wrong option, I think. Because what you can do is you change this from file properties to predefined pattern, and then you can add, so this is where you add all the different things you want to filter by. So say you want to filter by a credit card number, or if you wanted to filter by, you can search social. So you can filter by like social security numbers with and without dashes, for instance. So that's where you do that. And again, this all goes back into your security profile group. So if you had a data filtering profile, so if we were to save that change, we would just be able to set that there. Although right now it's just set to none. So what you actually have to do to apply all these rules is you'd come back over here to security. And let me make sure I have this set up right. It's under it's under one of these menus. Universal. So you can see here, there's this option called profile at the end here. And if you mouse over this, you can see that it's using that default security profile group that we just created. So anytime you make firewall rules, and this is really important to remember, if you want to do all that fancy stuff, if you want to do URL blocking, if you want to do anti-malware, if you want to do anti-spyware, if you want to do URL blocking, make sure you come over here and, where is it? Yeah, so then you just come down here and you set group profile default, or whatever you chose to name yours. And one other actually really important note I forgot to mention, whenever I was doing firewall rules, is if you come over here to service and URL, like URL category, you have the option when you're making these rules to do either any or application default. So what that means is, like I said, Palo has, since it's doing more stuff at the application layer, Palo will dig more deeply into what kind of traffic is coming into your network. So what you can set here is application default will say if you set that, if it detects SSH traffic, it'll categorize that traffic based on it being coming in on port 22. But if you set any, what that'll actually do is, since it's inspecting everything like coming into the network, it would catch SSH coming in on, say, a completely random port. So if you're setting that up, just keep in mind of whether you want to go specifically by port or like just the default application port, or if you just want to go more by application. So that's where you do that. I think that's all I have to show in this menu. Again, if you did want to search for applications, that tab is there again. You can also group applications. So, oh, this is actually really useful. So, especially for Windows, if you're on Palo, so you can just take that huge blob of ports that Windows likes to use for things like Active Directory and stuff like that, and you can cram them all into one application group. So you could give like MSRPC, LDAP, like 137, 138, 139, 445. Just give all the like Active Directory ports into one big port group. And then when you're setting firewall rules, instead of doing it port by port on every system, you can apply the port group for, say, Active Directory for like your domain controllers. And you just save yourself a bunch of times writing separate firewall rules. So I thought that was pretty neat. And just to confirm as well that our URL blocking is working, we can jump over here to our Windows tab. I literally just closed the window and then reopened the same window. I haven't had enough coffee today. So in theory, and I'll open a private window just to make sure we're not cached, we can try to hit DSU. Oh no, it's happening again. Hold on. Oh no. That's weird. I will say I've been having issues with this VApp all day, just intermittently losing internet connection, so I'm not sure what's going on with that, but I assure you, if we were to go to dsu.edu right now, it would go through. And if we tried to go to YouTube, since we have that application blocking in place, it would fail. Actually, let me try that on the web server. So in theory, we should be able to get to dsu.edu. Unless the networking for the whole VApp is broken, but that's fine. I've shown them needing to show. I'll come back to this in like 5 minutes. Okay, so if we come back to Palo again, I think we showed off that tab. So I kind of already touched on this, but we're going to come back to it anyways. So whenever you're going to get your Palo, if for whatever reason your untrust and trust zones don't exist, you can go ahead and make those here. This is where you can also apply a thing called a zone protection profile. So just like before, if you come down here, you can hit add, and basically what this does is you can check or uncheck these depending on what you need. You can change these settings to be whatever values you need or are looking for in your environment, but what you can do here is you can turn on things like protection from SYN floods. You can detect and block TCP and UDP port scans. So if you're trying to shut down a persistent red team or trying to nmap your whole network, you can do that here. You can do packet-based attack protection, which is pretty cool. Where is it? So basically, you can do all these different checking options to kind of dig into what kind of traffic is coming through your zones, and then take actions based on that. So this is good protection, like if for whatever reason someone wanted to DOS you. It's a pretty good place to get started. So this is another really powerful thing, and just like with firewall rules too, this is all for nothing basically if you don't actually apply it to your zones. So what we can do now is we can go back up to our zones, and I didn't actually make the profile, but if we did, all we would come down here and do is we would flip this where it says none to whatever the name of the zone protection profile we just made was. And if for whatever reason you wanted to come here and do it, you can also do this menu to make a zone protection profile. So we can go ahead and hit cancel on that. And if for whatever reason you were working with VLANs, you could manage that here. If you were doing vWire, which is a really neat Palo configuration. Doing layer 2 configurations on your Palo or doing a vWire configuration is really neat. It's something I've been playing around with in my own VApps, but something you probably won't see in like a mock competition. But still something neat to play around with if you have an interest in these kind of setups. DHCP servers, more stuff like this if you're setting up a network. And finally, we can get to the device tab. So essentially, the device tab is where all of your like changing passwords and stuff like that we did through the command line is going to live. So like if we come down here to administrators, we can see that we have our admins. You can, again, apply a bunch of different profiles. You can apply password profiles, stuff like that. You can check different roles that people have, so you can give and take away roles. So also, this is where you're going to do your licensing for the Palo that I mentioned. So whenever you first get your Palo, I don't know if it's going to be licensed at first, but either way, what you do is you come down here to licenses. So it wants to load. And it'll either automatically be licensed for you. You can hit retrieve keys from license server. You can manually upload a license, or you can use an authorization code to access features. And this is also where you're going to see the different versions on all the stuff you have installed. So like you can see that our definitions for like Bright Cloud URL filtering is up to date and stuff like that. So, and once you've done that, so once you've gotten your Palo activated, so kind of going backwards, this is going to be like the first thing you're going to want to do is to do all your licenses. You can come over here to dynamic updates. And the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to hit check now, because this will be blank when you first get here. So assuming all your licensing is done correctly, you'll hit check now. And then the applications and threats definitions will pop up. So what you'll do is you'll hit download on whatever the newest one is. And then once that gets installed, you can leave this menu, come back and hit check now again. And then these antivirus profiles will show up. And then again, you just hit download on the newest one of those. And then that'll load all the stuff you need to do, like the antivirus and anti-spyware, and all the stuff we went over in the objects tab. So you can also look at users here. This is basically where you're just going to do, like, also the admin doesn't show up here. That's fine. So essentially, this is where you're going to come to do, like, your early setup once you get to the web interface if you haven't already done it through the CLI. So yeah, that's basically a more or less a rundown over some of the stuff you can do with Palo. I encourage you all, whoever's going to be on Palo, for the next time you have a competition or mock competition, I encourage you to keep this VApp around, play with it, experiment with some of these features, watch this video again. This is all really powerful stuff, so if you're going to be the one using this Palo, make sure you use it to its fullest potential. Because, like I've said about a half a dozen times over, if you use this thing right, like, it'll shut down a lot of the more kind of common attacks you'll see. So that's about all I had as far as the web interface is concerned. Again, I just want to give a big shout out to Mike Garippo, who was here with me during a lot of like this VApp setup process and working on getting everything set up and ready for tonight. So he unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but wanted to give his regards to all of you guys. If you guys have any questions about Palo or getting stuff set up, feel free to reach out to either of us. We'd love to answer your questions. So yeah, with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and close out since I don't really think I missed anything. Does anyone have any questions? Lucas.
So from Palo Alto, are you ever able to really focus on the application level? I know there's an application filter for like SMB version 1. Is that something you've been able to use successfully?
Yeah, so I've played around with the Palo Altos. In particular, I remember one year at DakotaCon when I was on the exhibition team. I was the Palo admin, and I remember getting some of this stuff set up, and I was blocking like SMB v1 attacks and port scans and stuff like that. So you should be able to block all that kind of stuff. Galen. How do I secure what?
VoIP.
Voice over IP? That might be a little bit outside the scope of this presentation. There's a lot of securing you have to do like with your VoIP solutions as well. Anyone else? No? All right, I think I'll go ahead and call it quits there then. Remember, mock competition, is it Saturday or Sunday? Saturday. Yep, remember, mock on Saturday. Hope to see you all there. Not sure what we're going to be presenting on next week, but stay tuned in Slack, and we should have that out for you guys sometime in the near future. So have a great night. Thanks for coming.